Welcome to the Savage Worlds GM podcast. I'm your host, Jared Savage Daddy Gunning. Tonight's show brought to you by Roll20.net, the world's largest virtual tabletop. Check them out today at Roll20.net. Follow us on social media. We're on Twitter and Facebook at SWGM Podcast. Like, subscribe, and share on YouTube. Visit the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Savage Worlds GM Podcast. Like, subscribe, rate on iTunes, Savage Worlds GM Podcast. And if you dig what we do, throw us a buck on Patreon, patreon.com/SWGM Podcast. Tonight's topic, Cowboy Up. We're going to talk about running Westerns using Savage Worlds and more than just Deadlands. Here to discuss it, Chris, the Savage Mommy Fox.
Oh, there's no other thing but Deadlands for Westerns and Savage Worlds. Come on, Jared.
You would think so. Sixth Gun. Dave, the Rule Maven Scott.
I mean, why would you ever run a Western? Savage Worlds can't do anything but pulp.
And Dustin, the Savage Zealot Smith.
Well, howdy, Pilgrim.
I want to create a Mormon race. No, so let's talk about Savage Worlds and Westerns.
You have to roll for zealotry on a Mormon race, and you have to required hindrance missionary work.
No, required hindrance is polygamy.
No, that's the edge.
Oh, that's the edge?
That's the edge.
I'll give you that.
Hold on. This is a gender-specific edge for male characters and a hindrance for female characters.
No. It's generic. Like, it's the Weird West, and, like, we're throwing all the real-world rules out, so you take the follower's edge, but they're all your husbands/wives.
This conversation is making me uncomfortable.
Progression makes people uncomfortable.
So, of course, Deadlands, and if you're watching the live stream, feel free to comment. We do bring those comments and topics into the chat, into the live stream as well, into the discussion. So the other thing, the one thing I want to talk about, obviously there's Deadlands, obviously there's the Weird West, supernatural spookiness in the old Wild West, alternate timelines where the Civil War is extended or didn't happen, or Lincoln's still alive. Whatever you want to talk about is fine. Deadlands, obviously the Savage Worlds pinnacle premier flagship product. I'm not hating on Deadlands at all, but you don't need to go out and buy every Deadlands book ever printed, every plot point campaign ever made, and sit there and memorize every tome of that secret knowledge to run a Western. You don't need to do it.
Why didn't anybody tell me that before I kickstarted all of the plot points and bought all of the books? Ugh, damn it.
Well, I think there's an interesting aspect with Deadlands is that if you're brand new to Savage Worlds, brand new to PEG, and you come over and you look at Deadlands, you see the same kind of a layout of number of books that you would have to buy into if you were wanting to play, anything back, from the TSR era, or if you're wanting to play most of the D&D stuff from WotC, etc. You're going to see it's this endless splat book. The difference is it took PEG 10 years to release that much content for Deadlands, and some of it replaces old stuff, but for the most part, it's just, and here's yet another story, or here's yet another, thing of like what is their version of this year's in Robux catalog? I can't think of the name.
Smith and Robards.
Thank you. The Smith and Robard catalog is absolutely one of those great things to pick up, but it's completely unnecessary. You could absolutely run the game without it, but it just gives more of that Deadlands specific lore feel to what you're doing if your weird scientist pulls out one of those devices.
Right. And I would say this too. The Deadlands franchise and the books and the stuff that's there is great. It's turnkey, run a horror Wild West setting. It's all laid out for you very clearly. It doesn't require a lot of prep time or anything else. You can sort of just kind of pick it up and go. It does. I'm going to say this though. It does require some familiarity with Savage Worlds core rules, because it is a Savage Worlds product at the end of the day. But you don't necessarily. I think what happens too a lot if we start talking about, I want to run a Western. Everybody shouts, "Oh, go strip the horror components out of Deadlands and run a Western." And well, you can be successful doing that. But what do you do if you only have if all you have is the core rule book?
Mel Primus actually says that he ran Cowboys and Aliens using just core. It's all you need, and everything else is just flavoring.
I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. So, like for example, one of the things that you can consider, fanning the hammer on a single action revolver, that already exists as a rule in Savage Worlds core rules. It's called rapid attack. It's already in there. You're just basically using the rapid attack core rule maneuver to do fanning the hammer. Hanging, I have to say this. I'm a fan of the Deadlands hanging rules, where basically if you get dropped from a gallow, you're making a vigor roll not to snap your neck and die instantly. If you survive that vigor roll, well, then you're taking fatigue, battling against fatigue as you suffocate slowly until you reach incapacitation and die of suffocation. So, I mean, the hanging rules in Deadlands are pretty good. It's got a pretty complicated duel mechanic, though. Don't necessarily you could run that with a social conflict like we talked about before, as well. There's mounted combat rules. There's
merit to saying that the duel mechanic in Deadlands is completely unique, and it is designed to the hilt for Deadlands, complete with including specialized rules for some of the archetypes that only exist if you're using the rest of the Deadlands rules. So, right. I mean, there's good reason not to throw those out, but if you were running a non-Deadlands game, just a Western harvesting stuff out of there, I probably would leave behind the dual rules, unless you're also pulling some of the arcane background, some of the other stuff that's there that supports it, because it is so complex of a system.
Yeah.
It's flavoring because the duel it's playing poker, and I think that kind of slows the game down. But poker was so integral to that part of history and to the genre itself. Everybody, like, they got the Pharaoh tables in all the Westerns. Tombstone was over a game of poker if you think about it. So it really is integral, and I think they wanted to capture that, and they needed that, but it did just absolutely slow a duel down. Like, you're getting into the moment, you're feeling it, but poker is a major tone shift because you have to strategize and you have to think, and you're not in that sort of like, oh my gosh, moment.
Well, and I mean, stop and think about this. The gambling skill only exists in Savage Worlds because the initial frickin' setting was Deadlands. And poker was such a central part of that world. But that gambling skill has nothing to do with the real-life hand of poker you're required to run for the duel or for the, the cards
deal with the devil. Yeah.
The deal with the devil, for the Hexslinger. I mean, there's a lot of actual poker in the game that the gambling skill is never referenced for. And then you're using the gambling skill when it's time for your character to play poker. So it's this really interesting thing that they added a lot of poker to your role-playing game, and then they don't let you play poker when your character's playing poker.
Right, it's very meta.
So, Ruben Riviere asks, what are some common tropes in the cowboy genre do you feel can be crafted well in core?
Well, I mean, I think Jared touched on the very first one that comes to mind for me, and that's rapid attack as Fan the Hammer. Mm-hmm. I mean, that is a quintessential Western thing, that whole fanning of the hammer, and rapid attack already does that. I mean, it already lets you make that rapid set of attacks with his pistol. So that just is perfect. I think the other big thing, quite honestly, and it's one that we've touched on a bit, is vehicle rules. All the vehicle rules work so much better for Deadlands than they do for most other settings in Savage Worlds, because it's all based on a horse. Yep. So you have an actual pace and a creature that can take those wounds and whatnot, so you don't end up with this kind of a disjointed nature between the vehicle rule and the way it's gonna, the way it plays out in the narrative.
Dave, you don't shoot a man's horse. Come on.
No, I mean, not unless you want that man to shoot you back.
In the back.
I mean, so here's an interesting bit of history. Horse thievery was a capital offense. You could get killed for stealing a horse.
Oh yeah, they'd hang you for it.
Oh yeah, and they would hang you, I think sometimes without even trial. Infamous judge Roy Bean actually survived a hanging because he stole a horse.
I think posses are a big part of it. I mean, but that's kind of handled with extras. I mean, there's really not a whole lot I can think of. I mean, Core already has like mounted combat rules for horseback. If you're going to be on horseback, what happens if you fall off a horse that's, galloping? I would say if you were going to do some quintessential tropes, it really depends on what style of Western you're wanting to play. I mean, if you're trying to play very pulpy, Lone Ranger, Hi-Ho Silver, fist fights and gunfights really aren't that big a deal.
Original Wild Wild West TV show.
Yeah.
I think all of that pulp era, I almost hate to say it, but like the gun smokes and stuff like that, all of those can be done because 9 times out of 10, it's a fist fight with some broken bar stools and a piece of lumber. And if a gun is pulled, the gun is pulled only to threaten somebody, and then it turns into a fist fight later on.
Yeah, you've got the improvised weapon rules that fit that very well for those bar brawls. That's one of the things that's a trope that Core does just fine, is those types of bar stools and bottles and all those improvised weapons.
I think a lot of times when GMs are looking for running a Western and they have to get into the genre, that they really need to spend some time thinking about the tone and feel. And if we're going to talk about Westerns as a genre, you got to realize they split into subgenres. You have the spaghetti Westerns, which are full of anti-heroes. You have the classic Westerns where you have the white hats and the black hats, good and evil. Mostly, you have some that are just pure on frontier survival. And Deadlands brings in that Weird West horror aspect, which is not only survival, but it's denial of things that are terrifying. Now, that's a game mechanic. The fear levels are a game mechanic, but they bring a certain level of, if you're a storyteller, a certain level of gravitas in that you have to witness horrible things and keep them under your hat because you just don't talk about what's going on. And I don't know if anybody's really touched on how to bring that into a story, because even the horrifying things that are happening that are supernatural, there's horrifying things that are happening that are perfectly natural. I mean, you take Dances with Wolves, I mean, we're talking about a full-on slaughters on the way.
Right. I mean, it does break down to what your style of Old West that you want to play, but I don't think it's beyond the pale to say that most people are going to want to play the high action adventure pulp fisted angle of a Western if they're going to play it.
Right.
Well, I think to pay a little more directly to Ruben's question about what are the actual Western tropes that Core handles well, though, I mean, you've got obviously the chase scenes. There's almost always almost every Western includes some chasing, whether it's on horseback, or it's across the top of a moving train. It's where they're running along the balconies of the saloon and then down the banisters and stuff like that. Right. So you've got that's handled very easily with the Core rules version of a chase. And in fact, I think it's again one of those genres and settings where the chase rules are really, you can see how they're dialed in specifically for that, where you as a GM kind of know what the challenges are in advance. So when you draw those cards, you can describe that scene of, the loose clapboard in or the mud or the rut, or you've got to jump over the water trough and things like that. So I think that works really well. Obviously, I think the dramatic task or any of those periods of time where you have kind of and they crossed the desert. Okay, well, here's a dramatic task using, survival to maintain water and food and get across the desert to get to the other side and things like that. So I think where you really can break this down more so than looking at what any specific setting does is when you start looking at those core tropes. Savage Worlds was written as an extension of Deadlands. They were already trying to capture all those tropes in a game system. So Savage Worlds is born out of capturing Western tropes.
I'd agree. I would say that you're gonna want to have hanging as part of that, and you could use the Deadland rule for hanging. It works. If you want to make it less lethal, you just make it a vigor roll to avoid death from suffocation. You could even say, that somebody, if you get them before they hit incapacitation, or once they're incapacitated, you can revive them as if they're bleeding out, bring them, save them. I would say, I think probably the one thing that Core doesn't really kind of spell out for you easily, that's a trope that I think you're going to need, is going to be duels at high noon.
Yeah.
And that to me is a social conflict with intimidation and taunt, opposed roles, and a predetermined margin of victory table where there's automatic raised shots, or they're simultaneously making shooting rolls and it evolves into a shootout. But one of the things, if you're going to run duels as a social conflict, the GM has to know what the outcome is based on that margin of victory, and then it just automatically, boom, the winner does damage. There's no making a shooting roll on a certain margin of success. The winner of that duel just automatically draws and does 2d6 damage, or 2d6 damage with a raise to the loser. Outside of that, train robberies, bank robberies are going to be big. Barroom brawls with non-lethal damage and just fisticuffs are going to be big. We've already kind of talked about the improvisational fighter.
Is there a game out there that handles like the brawl scene the way Savage Worlds does? I mean, you've got really. Automatically everything's non-lethal damage, so you're only dealing with knockouts, not death. You're automatically dealing with a very fast and furious combat system, so a brawl is over about as fast as it is in the real world.
Right. Jailbreaks.
It's for being thrown through tables and windows.
Right. Jailbreaks might be a big part of it. But once again, it's like anything else with core rules. It's, well, what approximates dynamite? Grenade. Just use the stats for grenade, or an explosion and a medium burst template. Should do the trick. I mean, everything you need is already there. You've got the period piece weapons as well. The weapons table's already there.
One thing you certainly don't need a setting book for is to do Western game is a list of guns with different stats, because hashtag 2d6. Yep. And to be fair, I mean, a good number of the firearms listed in Savage Worlds are black powder, early era Western, and then later era revolvers and things. There's a considerable number of those weapons in that list because, well, again, they developed Deadlands really kind of first, and Savage Worlds was born out of, how do we take this game we already built and make it a little more generic? So they had all the stats for a lot of that stuff already. It's easy to dump that into the book.
Let's talk about Carlin Kindred. I think he's probably being sarcastic, but Uncle Jared, I need rules for how to drag a hombre behind my horse. What would Clint do? I would call that a dramatic task, actually.
It all depends on what set of rules you're looking for. Is this how do you accomplish dragging him versus how do you handle when you're the one that's tied up and being dragged? That's a vigor check every round for a dramatic task to withstand being dragged through town.
And maybe throw an agility check in there.
I would just say if you fail the dramatic task, you're incapacitated with bumps and bruises. Unless the idea is to kill you, and then it's a finishing move. They just gank you. They just kill you at the end. stab you.
You're already tied up. It's a coup de grace to begin with. But no, I agree. Like, there's a lot of different things, and I think, and I'm going to tie this to Sunset Sam's question. How about the gunfight or chase on top of the train? Best approach. We can't give a best approach to how to drag somebody down the middle of the road or how to handle the chase on top of the train or the gunfight, because each one of these is going to depend on the scene that's in your game, the actual setting you're trying to capture, the flavor of the game that you're playing with, the players at the table. If you've got players who aren't interested in a straight-up combat, you better be really good at feathering in things like the quick combat rules, the masked battles, the repurposing of like dramatic task and the social conflict to lift those combats out. Whereas at the same time, if you've got a group of players who are combat monkeys, they know Savage Worlds in, out, backwards, and forwards, and they know the combat rules, as soon as you drop that dramatic task in front of them instead of combat, those players are going to feel let down. So we can't give you the best approach to these. But I can say every single one of the tools in the Savage Worlds toolbox can handle those things.
Yeah, I would say make sure that if you're going to do that chase and gunfight on top of the train, unstable platform penalties. Don't forget those.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it also too depends. I mean, you may end up. It depends on your, like they were saying earlier. We were saying earlier. It depends on your style. If you want players to be able to jump off the top of a saloon into the saddle, and that is something you want to feature in your game, have the penalties for falling damage. To where falling off of a second story building, not that big of a deal. If you're if we're playing like a high adventure, high octane Western, call the setting rule rough and tumble, whatever, make it work for the setting you're doing, and just say, hey, they ignore the first 10-foot fall completely, and make it an agility roll to avoid bumps and bruises from getting into the saddle off anything else. Because falling damage in Savage Worlds is no joke. You take a look at falling damage, it's nasty. If you're looking for a kind of a gritty realism to your Western,
I mean, Savage Worlds has rules for falling off your horse that are pretty nasty. So I mean, let's just say if you want gritty realism, just run it rules as written.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to hurt when you fall off the top of the train.
Yep. When the train's going 60 miles an hour.
Yep.
And the track is everything around the track is basically gravel, hard stone and gravel. Oh yeah, that's not going to be pretty. You
want to take a rule that exists in Savage Worlds and repurpose it for something like that. Run a vehicle collision for how you calculate damage when your character tumbles off of a train and hits the ground. They're moving at X speed into a solid object. Bam. Yep. There's your dice roll. And I mean, I'm here to tell you right now, 60 miles an hour equates to quite a few dice of collision damage.
Now, if I'm playing Firefly, do I want that? No. I don't want that in a Firefly game. That doesn't capture the essence of running a Firefly game. Firefly game's very pulpy. Very, very pulpy.
They say it's not the fall that kills you, but that sudden stop.
Right. All at the end. Well, let's talk about this, like resource management in a Western game. Because I know Deadlands does a pretty good job. Like, everything is. Here's the quaint thing about money in an Old West game. Oh God, that luxury suite at the saloon, and female companionship and a bottle of whiskey, that's going to cost you 75 cents, partner.
Wow, you're getting the cheap stuff.
Or that's going to be $1.50.
I was going to go a whole $3 or $4.
Yeah, I mean,
I was going to say 25 cents, but then I'm thinking about the one horse town with toothless Sal, who's going to carry a couple buckets of cold water up to the room with her.
Right.
Wow.
But there again lies the rub is, and this is a place that I think Deadlands does an amazing job, is that whole second-hand gear aspect where you can buy the stuff that's been used. It's being sold to the general store. And the first time you have a failed dice roll, maybe it breaks.
Yeah, one of my favorite things is the El Cheapo horses.
Oh, yep.
Because you get to roll for a hindrance on the horse. And I actually, one of my players got an El Cheapo horse, and it was mean, had a sway back, so it would try to bite people all the time.
Oh, that's great.
Huge sway back. It was like really, really old. It was, and that horse became a character. It was awesome.
Right. Well, and also too, I think this is overlooked with El Cheapo gear too. If you buy El Cheapo gear clothing, it should give you a negative charisma.
Oh, it absolutely should.
Yeah.
It's tattered. It's got, the patches that are very visible patches.
Right. So yeah, I mean, running resource management in an Old West game, do you really care? Is it one of those things that you're going to kind of hand wave because becomes a story point?
So let me ask you this: how important do you feel ammunition management is in an Old West game? To me, it's a little more than most games, because when you have a 6-shooter, it's a 6-shooter. It kind of breaks the game a little bit when you have a 6-shooter and somebody never has to reload. So I think in a Western game, ammo management is something that you need to do.
Well, I was about to say, I think the Western game is the one where almost everyone agrees that we're tracking ammunition, but it's twofold. One is most of the Western weapons have a top end of about 12 rounds you have to track for even like the high end repeating rifles. So you've got a smaller pool of things to track. You're only tracking 6 bullets or 12 arrows in a quiver or what have you. You're not tracking, some of these weapons that we see in other settings where you might have 50 or 100 rounds in a drum attached to that rifle that you're trying to track. At that point, it starts, and then you start doing the math of auto fire where you have to do some multiplication and whatnot. You see a lot of people start dropping off that desire when you start getting into that. With the Wild West, you're mostly dealing with weapons that are single fire per round. There's not a lot there to have to track. If you fan the hammer, you've emptied the gun and have to reload. I mean, there's some pretty specific things that happen with that. I think all of us agree that it's just easier to track, and therefore it's something we like tracking because of what it brings to the game.
Well, I think you can find a happy middle ground too if you're playing more of a high action Western where you could just use the ammunition rules for extras from Savage Worlds. Like they start at a certain ammo level, high, extremely high, low, out.
I think kind
of do that as well.
That kind of brings up an interesting point, Dave, when it comes to tracking ammo, is that you have this whole genre issue in that fantasy, Western, and post-apocalyptic, you don't have to track as much. It's like, because there's a scarcity of resources, that's what makes it easier to manage and quicker. But then when you get into the whole modern, management of money and acquiring goods, and then you get into the sci-fi or even the superheroes. Like, superheroes don't need money because they're invincible. I love how Deadlands Noir actually handles this issue by giving everyone the poverty hindrance. So poverty is one of those things that we don't ever think about because we're not forcing people to buy food. We're not forcing them to rent hotels. But the truth of it is that's what eats up so much of our money, is just staying alive.
Yeah.
Life is expensive, man.
Well, I think there's an interesting aspect to the psychology of not wanting to worry about the same things that I worry about in my day-to-day life in my game. And I think that's a big part of why we see people who don't want to track encumbrance. They don't want to track ammunition. They don't want to track how much money it costs their character to get a sandwich or whatnot. With that said, I think, again, when it feeds the trope, when it feeds the double barrel shotgun, you get 2 shots and then you have to reload. When it feeds you've got a 6-shooter, you get 6 shots and then you have to reload. I think that becomes such a forefront part of that world. You can't let it slide, like Chris was saying. Right. It just doesn't feel right.
Yeah, it's important. It is important in that setting. Plain and simple.
I would agree. And there's an AMC series called Hell on Wheels that takes place with this. There's a situation between characters where they're basically being hunted by some bad guys. They're trying to kill these 2 characters. One of them's a practiced Civil War soldier, Confederate soldier, knows his way around a gun. He's trying to teach this person he's with how to shoot. So they do 1 target practice where he has him shoot the entire 6 loads and goes, there you go. Here's 6 bullets. And he goes, well, what do I do? He goes, keep your head, count your shots, count the other guy's shots, because it's not about who hits first. It's about who runs out of ammo first. So, I mean, it's very much a fabric and part of that story and that genre and that world. If you're trying to run it with any kind of realism whatsoever, that you track ammo and you require, multi-action penalties for reloading and quick draw and all that.
And thirst.
Yeah, so basic survival.
Yeah. And I think ammo tracking doesn't have to be that difficult. Go to Hobby Lobby, go to Michael's, buy some glass beads if you really want to. Give those people with the 6-shooter 6 glass beads. When they take a shot, they just move the glass bead. I have a friend of mine who got me a bag full of brass from a shooting range. Right. And I just hand them, shell casings and say, here's 6 shell casings. Use those. And as you use them, just put them off to the side. And then once you get ready to reload, grab your 6 shell casings or 12 or whatever you have, put them, and that makes it much easier to track. I'm getting ready to start Saturday. I'm starting my Deadlands Noir game. And I will probably have them because it's the same type of thing. It's 1930s, so I still think it's important. And I'm going to, give everybody the shell casings and have them track.
Chris, I wouldn't even do that. It's a 6-shooter. Take a 6-sided die and put it on 6, and then every time you take a shot, roll it down.
No, but that's not as much fun. Savage Worlds, you need your accoutrements in Savage Worlds.
But I'm going to side with Chris here. Savage Worlds is all about having little toys at the table. We have our bennies. We have our deck of cards. I want my shell casings for my bullet.
Don't take away my rule of cool, man.
All right.
I'm gonna say this for the ranged arrow quiver people. Grab a large office paper clip and toothpicks, and just put toothpicks on a paper clip. That's your quiver. As you pull toothpicks off and set them aside.
And actually fire at one of the players. No, don't do that.
Yeah, with a rubber band, make your own bow. And fire at the
if you really want, I watch a lot of crafting videos like DM Scotty and the DMG. One of those guys, I don't remember who, but they took the little toothpicks, the plastic ones that look like arrows, and they painted them, and then made paper feathers, flocking, whatever. What do you call it? Fletching, and he made little quivers out of just foam core, and gave his players a little quiver and actual things that looked like arrows, and it was awesome. Now I don't know if I would put that much work into it. I like Jared's paperclip and toothpicks because it's quick.
Yeah,
I would recommend this too.
Depending on how long you're going to play the game, and now to be fair, I will say this: if everyone in the party is playing, you're playing a group of old ways Native American characters, then absolutely you go to the extra mile and make sure all your ammo is not brass casings, it's little arrows and little quivers.
Right.
But again, if you might have one guy who's carrying a bow out of the rest of the party, I'm not going to all the extra effort for that one character.
Right. Screw that one guy.
The old way
put that effort in and make his own quiver from the YouTube video.
The old ways hindrance is one of the worst. No, it's one of the best and one of the worst hindrances at the same time, because this like everybody else is going to board a train and they'll be there in a day or two. And then you have that one player that's like, well, I can't. I guess I'll just ride my donkey across the desert for the next week.
Well, let's explain too. So the old ways hindrance, if you're playing a tribal shaman or a Native American, indigenous people in a Western, you honor the old ways. You don't believe in modern convenience or conveyance or weapons. So you have that hindrance.
It's evil.
Right.
Now they did rework that a little bit to make it, if you want to, a little less of a hindrance, because they do have a major and a minor version of it.
Yeah.
Right. But I agree with Dustin. Every time I run Deadlands and I have somebody who does do, the shaman, the Native American person, things like, I'm always like, oh God, please don't take old ways. Please don't take old ways, because it's going to be a pain in the ass.
Well, and here's the thing I would say to that is, as a GM, it's not my pain in the ass. Mm-hmm. It's entirely the party's pain in the ass.
Yeah, that's true.
And we had this come up in one of the games that Jared was running back early on when I had first kind of joined Jared's gaming group. The guy who was playing opposite me wanted to play a character that was mute and talked in sign language to my character. And Jared didn't like the idea of this character taking a hindrance that affected the way the role play of the rest of the party would occur. And he compared it to things like, having somebody take the blind hindrance and having to have another character constantly describe to them what's in the scene or lead them through, physical areas, things like that. And then to a certain extent, I understand where that came from, but I kind of chapped Jared's ass about it. Is at the end of the day, that's the player's choice to have to overcome that hurdle. And if the other players don't want to support them, the game has some built-in, penalties for that. If nobody else wants to not take the train, then your character arrives a week late. If nobody wants to lead your character through the area and you decided to take blind, well, then your character maneuvers through there at a I believe it's a -2 or a -4 penalty to any rolls necessary. I mean, there are specific hard-written rules in place where, as a GM, it doesn't have to be a pain in the ass to run those things, but it's up to the players to figure out how to get past those.
Right. It's really, to me, it's part of a session 0 conversation. And the reason I was like, no, I'm not a fan of that idea is because it can impinge on other people's fun and role play and make it a chore because this one person wants to do this one particular thing with the character. I mean, if everybody's on board with it as a GM, I'm fine with it. If everybody's on board and all the other players are like, oh yeah, that sounds like a great idea. We love that challenge. That's a great idea. Go for it. But I would also say, too, that the one thing you would need to impress upon your player characters in an Old West setting is the importance of cover and range penalties. And do not let people draw their weapons or go, oh, no, I already have my gun out. No, you didn't say you drew your gun. Screw you. It's a -2 penalty, multi-action to draw.
You are not walking around with your gun out all the time. Right. That's not happening.
Beyond the whole aspect of I already had my gun out, you didn't declare it. It's a trope of the genre of that draw of the gun. You have to enforce the quick draw rule because of it. And make them do the quick draws and make them make the agility, the agility check at -2. To pull that gun and also fan the hammer because it's a complex action they're trying to do together.
And if that person wants to do it, there's ways to mitigate it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, there's edges. Let them take the edge. Let them take the quick draw edge. But I'm just saying, don't hand wave you have to draw your weapon from the holster in an Old West game. No, and cover makes a difference. It should be an important part of the game if you're doing shootouts and bow and arrow attacks. Cover and range penalties and lighting penalties, as a GM, you really need to enforce those if you're going to be playing a Wild West or Western setting.
Otherwise, you're going to find everyone has a D8 shooting and hits every time if you're not enforcing all of the rules.
Right.
Now, you could even also, too, as a game rule, depending on what you want to do, you could say, hey, we're going to increase, we're gonna add something to melee weapons. When you roll a 1, they break or they malfunction something. Like the tomahawk, that what's holding the tomahawk on place on the handle, the leather strapping on a 1 on your melee roll on the fighting roll, it unravels. It's good for this attack, or if you want to do that, or increase the
cheapo gear like we talked about earlier, though.
Yeah, you can do that as well.
You know, I wouldn't penalize somebody who has their brand new, the brand spanking new thing they paid full price for, and then they happen to roll a 1 on their skill die, and it shatters in their hand. I think the El Cheapo, where you got the second hand thing, and now it's stuck somewhere or broken, works perfectly.
So what do you think about increasing the penalty for the not the penalty, but the rolling a 1 on the shooting die to a 1 or a 2? Let's just talk about that real quick in an Old West game with that level of guns, or do we care?
You saying for like friendly fire?
No, I'm saying like you if you roll with a shooting roll in Savage Worlds, if you roll a 1, it's innocent bystander. What if you increase that to a 1 or 2?
That would be more. All right, so in terms of actual real world duels, in the movies, it's there are people standing along the edges. They're like a block apart. They're sitting there waiting. In real life, people were face to face and drunk as sin, and still couldn't hit one another.
No further apart than a card table most of the time.
Most of the time. Like the movies are wrong, and the truth of it is, if somebody pulls a gun, you run away. That's basic survival.
For cover because the drunk motherfucker is waving iron around.
Yeah, that was reality, right? Like, part of the reason why John Wesley Hardin was one of the greatest gunfighters ever, and there are 2 reasons. One, he had a vest that was sewn up so that he could get to his guns faster. And 2, he couldn't hold his liquor all too well, but he could shoot straight when he had it in him.
Well, I think there's an interesting question there, and it's something I've noticed in a lot of games. Is it all depends on the level of verisimilitude your players are looking for. If your players are looking for an authentic Old West experience, then you're going to increase the natural tendency for things to misfire. You're going to increase the natural tendency to have an inaccurate round come out of the bullet because of bad machining on the barrel, whatnot. But along with that is, if your players are not looking for that, then you start going down a path of punishing them for trying to play the tropes they want to play. The gunslinger suddenly finds himself with a double chance to shoot his friends.
True.
The player who took the scatter gun because he's not going to take a high shooting suddenly has a 50% chance on a D6 on his wild die to constantly shoot an allied extra or a friend, because the shotgun was already 1 to 2. If we're extending the rifled weapons to 1 to 2, your shotgun extends to 1 to 3 at that point naturally. Right. So you start really kind of going down a path that becomes punishing, and that's where you have to draw that line. Like, I know we talk about Jared's Dead End game all the time, the zombie game. That's designed right from the core to be a punishing, savage environment. You wouldn't go into that trying to play John Wick-esque characters, because you're just not going to accomplish much before you're dead.
Right.
With that said, the players in that game expect a 1 on the shooting die is a wound to a member of the party or an allied extra. And if you don't deliver on that, it seems out of place.
Right.
I want to say that if you really wanted to punish a player, if you really wanted to be a terrible, terrible GM, a lot of people actually got sick from dysentery and gangrene. So look at your disease rules. And if people start failing those survival checks or start failing those vigor checks in a long ride, start enforcing those diseases. You got to think about it. In those days, people died from a hole in their shoe.
Well, I mean, you want to take this a step further. Anyone who takes a wound, it's a healing roll every day to tend to the bandages or else they're risking disease and infection.
Infection, yeah.
I mean, more people died of the infection from a bullet wound than died of the bullet wound.
Right, but I don't think anybody out there who is playing Savage Worlds wants to play a vermicelitude game of the Wild West where there's cholera and and oh god, I got an infection. You could, I guess.
I think that the person who's making this claim is the GM who would run that game and punish his players because he has a track record of running those kind of settings, though. So I wouldn't say no one. You have a large audience that wants to play Dead End.
Well,
so apparently people want to be punished occasionally in Savage Worlds.
Yeah, but I would say if you're getting into, I mean, let's talk about the Wild West genre. It's about fun. It's about adventure. It's about shooting. It's about duels at high noon and the thrill of a horse chase or robbing a train. It's not the make a bathroom check every 8 hours.
Right. You're not playing Oregon Trail, the computer game.
Right. This isn't Savage Donner Party that we're playing here. This is we're talking about playing a Wild West game.
So I want to throw something out there for people who might be interested, because we're talking about you don't have to get all the books for Deadlands. There's a book out there that I would highly recommend. It's on RPG Now. It's from Doghouse Rules, which is a company that Carl Kiesler works with, and it's called Fort Griffin Savaged. And it's basically a Old West town, and it's got, just tons of buildings, and each building they give the rundown of the building, who the people you're going to find at the building are, and then tons and tons and tons of plot hooks, and you could run an entire campaign just around this one town. And if you really want to look, they offer, if you want to add that Weird West thing, here's how you could change this character to do that. So it's very, very worthwhile.
Right. Damn, Chris, you beat me to the punch. I was going to talk about Doghouse Rules at some point here soon.
I would also say, so let's talk about it real quick. So let's say you want to have mysticism in the game. Do you want to bring in the tribal shaman, the Indian medicine man kind of thing? You can absolutely do that with Miracle's arcane background and adapt that. If you want a more simplified version, I would just say allow a Native American NPC who's a tribal medicine person to have the greater healing power, and just use that as maybe a tribal medicine situation. I mean, it depends on how deep down that rabbit hole of Native American mysticism you want to go in the game. Pretty much, I mean, in my experience, most of the Wild West games are going to focus on Native Americans on the warpath, in the outskirts of a town, on the frontier where it's being settled. You may want to have rules for scalping if you're going to be doing a thing where it's a vigor roll.
It's a coup de grace.
Well, but people survive scalpings, though.
It's a coup de grace still. I mean, you're brutalized at that point. Like, they can survive it, but it's just that. It's just, you have them down, you can kill them, or you can humiliate them, and you just humiliate them. It's a coup de grace.
I go the other direction with this a little bit. I agree with Dustin that if it's it's a question of how does the player pull off a scalping or whatnot, it is absolutely coup de grace. I think that there's some interesting stuff there to have them take the scar hindrance if they personally get scalped, and you have that penalty to charisma from that point forward. With that said, though, I think there's a lot to be said about don't go too deep in trying to recreate some of these things as well, because at the end of the day, you don't want a mechanic that stops the gameplay because you thought it would be really cool to have a scalping mechanic, or you thought it would be really cool to have a hanging mechanic. It needs to fit the flow of the game that you're already running, rather than being something that brings that gameplay to a sudden stop and now you're consulting tables or multiple dice rolls or opposed rolls, when really what just happened is, oh, this character got scalped. I'm going to describe it in as glorious detail as my players are expecting, and then move on to the next part of the scene. There's a lot to be said about getting off in the bushes, especially in the Western genre, because there's already a lot of rules you can just grab and run with. When you start going too deep in that rabbit hole, if it doesn't already exist from PEG or one of the other licensees, there's a good chance there's a reason why.
Right. I would also say too, maybe drinking. Maybe you want to make vigor rolls for inebriation.
I think so. If you want to be funny about it, you could start imposing some hindrances. Like, okay, you failed a vigor roll here, so now you're going to take the lame hindrance because you can't quite get your bearings. All right, you failed another one. Now you're starting to things are getting blurry, so you're getting bad eyes. Eventually,
or you could just make it a simple fatigue roll from alcohol for failing a vigor roll for drinking alcohol, and then the -1 penalty handles it.
I would say that.
Perhaps however you want. I mean,
yeah, that's definite. I'm just saying that if you wanted to be funny, and if you wanted to, obviously having a shot or a couple of shots isn't going to do that to you. But if you drink a lot, you're starting to get lame, and you're starting to get bad eyes, depending on how much.
Yeah, if you want to go that way. I would say that I would definitely allow the Liquid Courage Weird Edge in a Western. Absolutely. The whole Beastmaster kind of weird, the Beastmaster thing. Yeah, let him have a pet coyote. Let him have a pet wolf. Aside as I would encourage players at Born a Hero to take a horse as a sidekick. Mm-hmm. As an extra. It's the Trigger, the Gene Autry's. Oh, this is my trademark horse, so to speak. Yeah.
I think another one that, and again, obviously, Deadlands handles this really well, is, don't shy away from weird science. It belongs in the Western setting, because that was an era of people strapping steam engines to everything.
Yeah.
That was an era of people saying, hey, this can do this. What if I add this piece of glass here and a little clamp that comes up and all these really weird devices come out of nowhere? Absolutely let your players run hog wild describing these amazing mechanical devices, and run them like a weird science device, even if no one in the party has weird science.
Yeah, one of my favorite parts of The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, the classic spaghetti Western, is I can never remember the actor's first name, but his last name is Clef.
Clef.
Yeah, had the attachment to his 6-shooter that had a rifle stock and magically extended the range. Just magically turned that pistol into a rifle for the range and accuracy. What? Rule of cool. Let it happen in your Wild West game. Yeah, it was Age of Steam.
Art definitely has an interesting question here. What about having characters from other settings being treated as a tenderfoot when they start because they're not used to the West? Down this road lies madness.
Well, is he talking about in the Western, they're from the East Coast? Or is he saying I'm bringing somebody in from a fantasy setting?
I think he's talking about fantasy
setting, but I think in all reality, what he's talking about is the guy who's the city slicker who heads out.
Greenhorn.
Oh, sure, why not?
And the reason I say down this path lies madness is, again, you're punishing a player for wanting to roleplay a specific character. They're wanting to play that. Let that player punish themselves. They will be more vicious in the things they decide their character can't do in the name of roleplay than you could ever be to them in the name of penalties. And also, unless you're going to let them take it as a hindrance or something, just automatically applying that as a setting rule to one or two members of your party is a dick fucking move, because now you're saying You guys all said you're from Texas. Your characters are fine, but you said your character's from Maine. I'm going to fuck you on every dice roll for the first 3 sessions as you get your feet under you in the West. That's just bullshit.
I don't disagree. I would say, they could, if the player wants to use what exists to kind of role play that out, they can always take the outsider hindrance.
Oh, there you go. That would solve that issue right there.
Hey, yeah. Mr. Fancy Pants from Maryland, we don't like your kind here. You could do that easily in a Western. There
you go. Yeah, and that solves that entire issue. Just take outsider if you want.
And that's what I was saying. If you want to give them a hindrance and let them role play that, that's great. If you want to let them just apply it as narrative trapping stuff on top of their character, that's great. But make sure they're getting something out of it, because the actual what it was like to be a tenderfoot is you got sores in places you didn't know you had. Especially riding, saddle sores killed a lot of people as far as their ability to do anything. It was amazingly harsh on people who weren't up to the rigors of living in the West. So the tenderfoot thing is an honest-to-goodness thing, but that's a pretty steep hill to make one player out of the party climb unless they're getting some kind of a reward. And I definitely think depending on what you stack up against them, outsider handles it. But I think if you wanted other tangible penalties, -1 to things like riding or additional vigor rolls to avoid fatigue, stuff like that could be done in the name of a minor or major hindrance.
So I'm going to offer a chance for somebody to put that check mark in their bingo card and go ahead and say that could be a session 0 conversation.
Right.
Yeah, that's the adult conversation before the game begins.
Yay, bingo! Gonna have a drink now.
So let's talk the obvious. I just really quickly want to touch on the obvious Firefly questions that are going to come up, because they always come up whenever you talk about Western and you mention Savage Worlds. You run the core. It's really yes, it's a Western with spaceships. And the more civilized areas represent the east coast of the United States. The underdeveloped, under-terraformed planets represent the frontier. It's just all so much a trappings coat of paint on everything that you see in Firefly. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, we have steam-powered locomotives. Yes. Oh, and we have hovering spaceships that can enter Atmo and not enter Atmo. They exist side by side. It's okay. Go ahead. But you'll notice that the members of Firefly are not firing blaster pistols. They're still sticking to their dodging Old West trope.
But
yeah.
I will say this. Do yourself a favor if you're wanting to grab an existing product out there, as far as whether it's Firefly, whether it's Trigun, whether it's Gunsmoke. Take a look at some of the supplementary stuff that's been released by licensees. Tag does a lot of this. Triple Ace Games, they've got the Pulp Companion, and they've got the Sci-Fi Companion. You grab just a couple of their little, what is it? The Space Lanes and the Pulp one. Combine those together, and you can do with Core. You can do Firefly perfectly. And they add some really interesting stuff that belongs in this type of a game, especially that Pulp one. The surrender rule is amazing because it's such a huge trope of, the damsel in distress with a gun to her head, and now you're throwing your guns in the dirt and walking off with the bad guy.
Right.
Yeah, and there's also a product out there that's a generic product. It's on my bookshelf. I don't have it near me, but it's a Cowtown creator. It's for creating Old West towns, and it's an entire book on just creating Old West towns. You could take that book, create your own Old West town, and core rules, and you're good to go.
Yeah.
And I mean, don't shy away from using any of the products that are out there. I mean, again, because Savage Worlds was kind of born from Peg's creation of Deadlands from Rail Wars, you have 10 years or more now. I think it's closer to almost 13. years of just product after product after product from them and from the licensees. There's a lot of material available. Don't be shy about picking up one or two of those products and just pulling out what you want and leaving behind what you don't.
Right. And I would say the most important thing to do if you're going to play a Western and Savage Worlds is respect the genre. Go immerse yourself. There's plenty of stuff. If you want to run a weird supernatural bent, there's Wynonna Earp on Netflix. You can watch that series. There's the original Deadwood from HBO. Get a sense, immerse yourself in the genre so that you're really familiar with the tropes, and that really kind of helps you with your improv GM role play at the table.
Watch the first season of Westworld, and you can run a really good Weird West.
Yep.
Second season, let's see where it goes. This is getting a little too weird for a Western game.
Right, and you could play the Western robot Westworld thing. Just give the NPCs the construct special ability, and you're done. Yep. Really, at the end of the day, there's still NPC characters in a Wild West setting. They just have the construct ability. At the end of the day. I'm thinking, is there any stone we've left unturned in the Wild Wild West? We didn't talk about.
No. It looks like we've been covering it for the most part.
I mean, you can always focus on the lawlessness too.
Yeah.
The lawless, but that's part of the trope. That can be part.
Well,
of the
and I think you have to be careful with that. You don't want to overdo the lawlessness aspect of it. You don't want your players becoming enforced murder hobos. Right. You can play up the way frontier justice was handled, where things were a hanging judge who just everyone who came through court that day was going to the hanging tree unless it could be demonstrated that they were not the one who did it, and you could have a character, stand trial for a $2 offense, and really make an entire session out of just what the drama of trying to keep Dustin's neck out of the news because, he walked into town, sat down and bought a drink for the mayor's wife.
Right. I would say too that I would add this as a GM trick or tip if you're going to run a Wild West setting. The saloon's a big part of it. The saloon's a big center stage in any Western. I would say have NPCs get shot for cheating at cards. Yep. Shot dead at the table. Let the NPC become part of that set environment to telegraph to the players, hey, this is a little fast and loose. Be careful. Be careful who you bump into, who you disrespect, because people are a little fast with the gun. Hey, you're cheating. There's no way you got a hand like that unless you're cheating. Oh, you calling me a cheat? And then they stand up and just gun each other down at the table. And the music stops for a second and then picks right back up and starts playing again. Play into that trope. Telegraph those things with NPCs. Let them feel the temperature of the mood of the town and everything in the setting by killing NPCs.
When one of your players starts, taking all of the gunslinger edges, have someone call them out. They ride into town and, out of nowhere, up rides, Jeb Smith from, Fort Hector out there. I heard about you. They say you got the fastest gun. I'm calling you out. And enforce those random events that are so much a dyed-in-the-wool trope of that environment.
So you got to know that there are some places that those edges and that great shooting skill aren't going to help you because you've got to turn your weapons in when you come into town.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think there will still be people trying to get by that one, and not just the players. I think there's going to be NPCs. So I don't know if we've actually touched on it because I dropped out for a minute there, but the Magnificent Seven is not just a story, it's almost a genre staple in the Western. You come to town and somebody has beaten the crud out of the townsfolk in some capacity, and they're afraid, and they can't get any kind of like real protection. So the players have to take it upon themselves to be the protectors of that town in some capacity, and they have to make a last stand in a ghost town.
And they were betrayed at some point during this by one of the people who are trying to help, because the fear level of that person is so high, they have to turn the players in to whoever the big bad is. I mean, there's certain aspects of that it's absolutely a formula, but if you run the formula right, your players get exactly what they want.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a genre staple of something wicked this way comes. Something is coming to the area where the players are. High Noon does it. The Magnificent Seven does it.
Blazing Saddles does it.
Blazing Saddles does it. Just keep in mind, if you're going to have that game, Brighton Towns, folks, something is coming to kill them, and you are the frighteningly awesome group that's going to save them.
Right. The Three Amigos does it.
Clint Eastwood. I forget which one it is. It's one of the spaghetti westerns. It's the one where he paints the whole town red.
I think it's High Plains Drifter, isn't it?
It might be
High Plains Drifter.
But in that one, it's a little bit of a twist, because instead of something wicked this way comes, it's like you came to the wrong hood. Because let me tell you, he brutalizes those guys.
Something wicked here resides.
Right.
Like, what were you thinking? Like, seriously, the guy painted the whole town red like hell, and he literally whipped a man to death outside the bar.
Right. Well, and you can also have too. I would say this too. Another staple of the genre is the greedy, manipulative, untrusting NPC allied extra. The guy who gets the drop on you and the bandito who's heard about this score and gets the drop on you in your saloon room and forces you to you're going to hang yourself. And at the last minute, decides we're not going to hang you. Something happens, but the guy ends up just brutalizing you. Is about to kill you, and then you have a secret that he needs to satisfy his greed. So, oh god, now we're uneasy allies. We're only allies because we don't trust each other. We're only allies because we need both of our submarine keys to be turned at the same time to get the gold. Because I know the name of the cemetery, you know the name of the grave.
Yeah, it absolutely has to be a Chekhov's gun moment in your game where the player characters have something that NPC needs, and that's the only reason they're allowed to survive. And the player characters have to be aware that that's the reason they were allowed to survive.
Right, and the player characters know that this person is going to stab them in the back the very first chance they get. So it's not a surprise like Dick GM move, like, oh, that guy betrayed me. Oh, no. You knew he was going to betray you. Come on.
Betrayals should be written very highly in foreshadowing in a Western game. But that's more GM style than it is, a mechanical Savage Worlds question. But absolutely, I think that's one of those, Westerns by and large were very formulaic, and you saw the thing coming. Mm-hmm. You knew what was around the corner before it happened.
Yeah, and almost like every Western NPC is either greedy or incredibly pious and upright. That's the only two flavors they really come in. I'm incredibly greedy and I'll do anything to make a quick buck. I'm also the town preacher and I very much have a high moral standard.
Oh, that's one we didn't touch on at all, but I think it's just a quick note. Run religion.
Yeah.
You really want to capture that feel. Every town has a small chaplain in it that's run by, the pastor that's a fire and brimstone pastor trying to save the wicked people of the West. Every single town has that in one variation or another, from the ultra pious to the snivy, just slimy pastor who's only a pastor in namesake with the collar, but is bilking the town with snake oil.
Yep, a week ago he may have been a bounty hunter. This week he's a pious preacher. Yeah.
And Deadlands lets you run that, and I love the stories where you had somebody with the arcane background, miracles, and sometimes I'll have players just get the arcane background, miracles, just to like mess with them. Like, this is in the Old West, you can kind of play fast and loose with that whole vengeful, righteous God. You get a gunslinger that's putting the right bullets in the right targets, and the angels are saying, "Yeah, we'll kick a few cents your way."
Well, you can always do this too as a GM. You can always go. You can always have them roll into a town, and the preacher basically beseeches them to provide protection while they go out and witness to the Indians.
Mm-hmm.
We're gonna make a mission out into the wilderness. God has called us. We're gonna go out and save the heathens. We're going to go save them, but we need men with guns to protect us and serve as our guardian angels, and that could be a whole 2 or 3 session plot arc.
I want to say this, that the speak language power and a very high persuasion comes in handy if you're caught in that situation. And I love how in the Deadlands system, or in the Deadlands setting, I don't particularly like the fact that we've gone through like 4 and 5 different iterations of the Blessed, because every time a new campaign comes out, I'm always excited to see how they're going to change it now. But in the Deadlands setting, having multiple languages really does affect things, because people can and will get killed for not knowing what to say. And I love the fact that the Blessed, you can always write it off because it's based off of a real world belief. The Blessed is supposed to be trapped in such a way that it leaves reasonable doubt.
Well, I would say this too. So just following up a little bit on the thing, go watch a Clint Eastwood movie called 2 Mules for Sister Sarah. If you want to see what that is. Great story. He's a bounty hunter, a mercenary, who ends up getting mixed up with a nun.
And she's not exactly the best nun.
Right. And they can be the characters, I would say, really one of the great things to do with a Western is really play into your NPCs, make them incredibly colorful, and play with the tropes. Like, have the cigar smoking, whiskey swilling nun, no nonsense nun.
And you got to have Cookie. You got to have Cookie, the guy who's out there with the guys running the cattle, and he's their cook, and you gotta have him.
Yeah, your NPC has to shout. Yeah, your NPC has to shout "Karn Sarnit" every other sentence. Yeah. One of my favorite characters in Blazing Saddles is the miner who nobody can understand. What? I agree with Goody.
He speaks authentic Western.
And in the Deadlands setting, that's Coot Jenkins.
Yeah, languages could be interesting. I mean, you may want to have like just everybody basically speaks English, but then you can have Spanish as a language. So if they're in the Southwest, somebody who has knowledge Spanish at a D4 or D6 might come in handy. Someone who speaks knowledge Cherokee,
Cantonese, or a plethora of Pacific Rim languages because of that whole influx of people across that ocean.
Yep.
There's a lot to be said about just how big an area you're dealing with when you start talking about we're going to play a Western game. You're talking way up into Canada and most of Central America are all considered canon parts of the West. So you've got a large area to deal with for your players to pull characters from. Portuguese is a big language in parts of those areas. You also can run into just the German mad scientist who happens to be in Dodge City for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, there's a lot of those things that are tropes of that because of the fact the Western got so tied to the pulp storytelling that it became kind of this unified thing.
And if you
go ahead,
say, if you want to listen, I know a lot of people don't like actual plays, but there's an actual play out there called Sounds Like Crows. It is one of the best Deadlands actual plays I've ever heard. We're interviewing the GM on Saturday, and I would say if you're getting ready to run a Western or run Deadlands, go out there, look for Sounds Like Crows, give it a listen. They're role players, they get a little goofy occasionally, but the quality of their episodes and the quality of this actual play is phenomenal.
Right. Well, and I would also mention too that you can have post-Civil War animosity. Have a Confederate character come out to the West and run into some Yankees.
They did
in the street. Yeah, that should be part of the Western drama and trope.
Have a Yankee run into an entire group of Confederates and just start singing, glory. I mean,
in True Grit, that was one of the major plot points between the Rooster Cogburn and the Marshal, was the fact that the Marshal at one point had been a Confederate and Rooster had been Union, and Rooster actually lost an eye, and there was a lot of animosity. If you look at the movie, it's just like, okay, this is just a measuring contest. But if you read the book, they are very much they're from two different countries that are very similar, and they're arguing about it, but they're doing it in such a polite way because you couldn't address it. Like, it was that elephant in the room that the only time anybody ever mentioned the Civil War was when they have just completely lost control and were just screaming about it.
Right. Well, and I'll reference Hell on Wheels again, too, just for a story thing. Part of it is the main character is an ex-Confederate soldier whose family gets murdered, and he comes home to find his wife hung on the front porch and his entire farm or plantation basically burned down. And he goes out west on a killing spree, on a revenge spree, and then ends up working for the railroad, the Union Pacific Railroad, as a foreman. So one of the things is he has to rely on the cavalry to help stave off Indian attacks and provide some militia to the railroad. And there is this one scene where he has to go out and they're trying to cut off an Indian war party, and it's being led by a blue coat. And there is friction because the guy's carrying a cavalry saber, Confederate cavalry saber. And he asked him at one point, "Where did you get the saber?" And he goes, "Oh, I picked it up at this battle and blah, blah, blah. And it was glorious. And we killed so many Confederate scum that day." And he's talking to an ex-Confederate
who was at the battle,
who says, "Yeah, I was at that battle. The only reason you took that bridge is because we ran out of ammo. And I have a feeling you yellow-bellied picked that cavalry saber up off of a dead man." They almost come to blows right there at the campfire. So, I mean, it could be part of the setting, it could be part of the plot arc, it could be some drama that as a GM you could throw in, especially if you have a player character goes, "Yeah, I was a Civil War Confederate soldier and now I'm out in the West. All right, have them run into some blue coats every once in a while."
And it is also completely acceptable to throw it out entirely and not even address it.
Yeah.
To have your game completely not deal with any of those issues, because you might have a table full of players who are uncomfortable talking about that era or the things that came as fallout for it, and they don't want their characters to have to explore that in role play. So it's completely okay to say, we're playing in a game where we're focusing on it being the West. We're not even going to talk about this.
Yeah, we're not going to talk about emancipation or freed slaves. We're not going to even bring that topic up.
And that's actually culturally appropriate that people wouldn't talk about it, because it would result in a full-on riot at times in the real world. People just kind of like, they were mad, but people would just sort of like push it down and just try not to talk about it and get along. And that actually brings up an interesting character. You get those braggarts and those blowhards that would try and egg on a fight. Those are always the villains in a Western. the people that bring up the Civil War, that try and spur and stir the pot, they're carpetbaggers. They are villains.
Yeah, the extremely outspoken racist and chauvinist are the villains
and likely the moral grandstanding, like Union just transplant that's going to like bring culture and civility down to the Southerners. Both of them are the exact same character.
Yep. Yeah, it all depends on, whether or not you want to have that topic. And that always comes up. That's always could be a point of contention when you're running anything in a historical setting. Is like, okay, are we going to whitewash some of the really horrible social things that happened and just ignore them?
And it's entirely your group. It's okay to do it. It's okay not to do it. It's okay to dive, head first in and go through the heavy topic. It's also okay to leave that out because it's not fun. It all depends on your group. I would also say, and this is one of those things, keep in mind, and I know we're kind of getting a little long-winded tonight, but keep in mind, news didn't travel very fast in the West. Right. You're dealing with the advent of the telegraph is about halfway through the time period. You've got the Pony Express is a big part of that time period. Let your players have both the freedom from instantaneous news, but also the hindrance of they show up in town and no one's heard about what they did 2 towns over. They don't have a reputation as the good guys. They're just more cowpokes riding into town with guns, and the local authorities don't like random cowpokes with guns.
Right. Yep. Okay. Well, unless we have anything else in the chat to speak to, then I think we'll go ahead and close it down. So until next time, this is Jared Savage Daddy Gunning for Chris, Dave, and Dustin saying keep rolling and stay savage.